All right. I'm going to leave this up here for a moment while I get set, but if you've tuned in on YouTube, you are at the right place. Now with the correct time. All righty. Hello, and thanks for tuning in to Merge PHP, a set of user groups spanning North America, talking about PHP stuff. I am broadcasting this live from Austin PHP in Austin, Texas. However, we are pulling a speaker in from remote, so hence the technical shenanigans. So first we have to show off all the user groups represented by Merge PHP. This is how we keep high quality content coming in, meetup after meetup. Now, if you don't already have JetBrains All Products Pack, it's still my IDE family of choice. And whether you're using PHP Storm, WebStorm, or any number of their other tools, thanks to their generosity, we get a 1-year license to give away. Shoot an email to the email on your screen, and first one in gets the license. So there are a number of PHP conferences and events coming up. Quite soon is PHP UK, and then we have a mix of Drupal Camp, Confu in Montreal, which is a Polyglot conference, DPC, DrupalCon, Symfony Live, etc. Worth pointing out here that PHP Tech is in Chicago again this year. Toward the end of May, I have already grabbed tickets for that. You have missed early bird pricing for this, I believe, but you can still get tickets. It's an excellent conference. I'm sure as time goes on, we'll have more of these events pop up. So you can find us on socials. The biggest, most up-to-date one is going to be YouTube. You can also find back issues of previous presentations on the almost brand new phpc.tv. That's a PeerTube instance, no ads, supported by the community, and anything that we've broadcast on Merge PHP is there. So I would encourage you to check that out. Next month, we do have a talk lined up from Larry Garfield about doing advanced things with PHP Unit. It's actually a sneak preview of what I'll be presenting at Tech. So definitely tune in and see this before everybody else does. If you have a talk idea, currently we're looking to fill April and later. So you've got a couple months to prepare. If you have a talk idea, ping us on socials, and we'd love to get you set up in the lineup for later this year. With that, I'm going to pull Chris Miller on screen and hand it over to him to talk about domain-driven PHP.
Hey Ian, how you doing?
Doing all right. So got that, and go ahead and share your screen. I'll pull that up.
And that should now be sharing.
Got it. Yep. Cool. All right, take it away.
So yes, as Ian said, I'm talking about domain-driven PHP. So firstly, who am I? Well, the logo probably gives you a clue. I'm a developer at PHP Architect, and yes, we run PHP Tech. Early Bird has finished on PHP Tech, but it hasn't finished on JS Tech. If you happen to stumble on that website, it's still on there until the end of the month. So you can still get it at early bird pricing. So what are we going to talk about? Well, domain-driven PHP, but I'm going to use Dungeons and Dragons as an example. So in Dungeons and Dragons, there's always a thing called Session 0. And that's where you set the rules before the game begins. So we're going to set the rules before the talk really begins. So D. That's going to be fun to say for the rest of this talk. It's a talk about building software just the way you build a tabletop RPG. D&D, it's a game with rich, self-contained rules. DDD, that's a way to write code that mirrors those rules. DD&D, well, that's using one to teach the other. So what is D&D? Dungeons and Dragons. If you've seen Stranger Things, you've seen the main characters there playing Dungeons and Dragons and then literally living Dungeons and Dragons. So characters, they have hit points, armor classes, abilities, rules that govern combat, movement, magic. All of the things are preset in a big rule set. A dungeon master, the one that orchestrates the entire world. And then you have the player's handbook. That's what defines the rules, and the dungeon master applies them. So what's DDD? Domain-driven design. It writes code that speaks the language of the business, or in this case, the language of the game. You have value objects. They're immutable, self-validating concepts. So something that doesn't change. Entities, aggregates, they're objects with identity that enforce the rules. And then you have repositories, abstractions, they go way above persistence. Domain events, literally facts about what happened. One of my other talks is on event-driven architecture or event sourcing. Basically, DDD includes event-driven to a certain extent. So why does this combination work? Well, firstly, Dungeons and Dragons is something that I enjoy. And secondly, it literally already is a domain model. Hit points, they're a value object. They're not just an integer. They're not just a number. A character, it's an aggregate root. It enforces its own invariants. So things that never, ever change. The player's handbook, that's the ubiquitous language, the language that everybody talks. And the dungeon master, well, that's the application service. It orchestrates, but it doesn't decide what happens. So, Act 1. In Dungeons and Dragons, you'll often play in acts. So, Act 1, the vacuum. We're going to demonstrate building the core rules with absolutely no real dependencies. I am including Ramsey's UUID, but that's pretty much the only dependency. So this is basically what the directory structure would look like. You'd have a source folder, you'd have a name for it, and then you'd have application. That's the use cases, so commands, handlers, that kind of thing. The domain, that's the rules. It's absolutely pure PHP. Inside that, you'd have events, models, repositories. They're all things that help towards moving us forward in implementing the code that we want, isolated in sections that make sense. And then you've got infrastructure, which is the plumbing. So the repositories go in there, which are our concrete implementations. Now, I could choose to implement the entirety of Dungeons and Dragons in this, but that would take us until this time next year. So I'm not going to go for the whole thing. So what is a value object? We could just go with a variable of HP and say that's 10, and a variable of AC, that's 15, and DMG is 5. And then we can have an ID that's just a string, but that doesn't actually tell us anything. So when we look at that code, if you don't know what HP, AC, DMG, and ID are, well, then it doesn't make sense. Instead, we create a value object like hit points. So what is hit points? At its core, it is an integer. But we have a constructor that takes in the points that we want to create. It'll do a rule validation. So in Dungeons and Dragons, for example, a really simple rule, hit points can never, ever be a negative number. So we'll check that. And if that is the case, we'll throw an invalid argument. And if it's not, we'll set it to the points. But we can drop our points by taking in another object, a damage object. And we'll return a new version of the hit points that looks for the maximum value of 0 or whatever points is at the moment minus whatever the get amount is of damage. So in essence, that enforces our rule that it can never be lower than 0, because if your points are -1 and 0 is there, well, then the max is going to be 0. We can also check if it is 0 with a simple Boolean check, is points exactly equal to 0. Another one would be damage. So this is the one that we've just looked at. Damage can't be negative. You can't go and damage somebody and give them health. That really sounds like a bad idea in the game. So again, we do very similar check. We'll check that the amount that we're passing in isn't less than 0. We'll then assign it and we can get that amount back out. Now this feels like very, very simple PHP, and that's basically because it is. The PHP we're writing here is so simple that it enforces a basic rule. Now there could be 20 rules to this. We could be creating something that does 20 different checks on the amount first. So we could do damage can't be less than 0, damage can't be greater than 20, damage can't be exactly 0. We could do checks that damage has to be an even number. There's no limit to the amount of rules that we can fit in. And you could also choose to do custom exceptions. So here I'm just using invalid argument exception because it makes sense, but we could have a damage exception just by creating a class and throwing that instead. So it's exactly the same pattern as hit points. So why have we bothered creating this? Well, because it is self-validating. We pass in damage because we know what we want is to cause damage. And it's also immutable. So that damage, once you've created the object, can't be changed again. There's no way of resetting the object unless we go down the route of reflection and overriding the private. But in normal PHP, you can't overwrite that. We can also always have our armor class. So back on that other page, we had the integer AC. Now, as with others, the check here is simple. It can't be less than 0. We assign it and then we can get it, but we can't change it. So again, the character never asks, is my AC valid? Is my armor class valid? It can't be constructed as invalid. This prevents us from creating anything that we don't want to create. And then we'll get the character ID. This is the only package that I've imported, Ramses UUID, mainly because I didn't fancy implementing UUIDs myself. So we have a private UUID interface, a constructor that takes in the interface and sets it. We can generate a new instance, and we can also create it from string. So we can go in both directions here. So why would we do this? You can only create an ID by generating one or passing a valid one. Now, if we just used string and then created a UUID and passed it in, what's stopping me from going ABC, which isn't a valid UUID? This will enforce that our character ID has to be a UUID as it was originally intended. And then we've got the character ID. It carries on with two more things. So we can go to string. So we can say that we want our ID as a string. So we might want to use that to save the character. We might want to use that to put it on screen. And we can also check if the ID is exactly equal to one that we pass in. But we can only pass in a character ID. So it does equals instead of triple equals. Value objects compare by value and not reference. So we don't go character ID triple equals character ID. We use the equals function to check that those values are equal. By passing it in, and on this ID, we call equals the other ID. That ensures that we can check that the ID that we are looking at is the same ID number. It may not be the same instance of character ID, but it is the same value. So character status. In Dungeons and Dragons, you have two statuses. You can either be conscious or unconscious. Here in the UK, it's just gone 1 in the morning, so I would normally be in the unconscious state at the moment, but I'm actually in the conscious state because I was invited to speak here. But this is a really simple PHP enum, and it prevents us from going, is this alive without a capital, alive with a capital? Is it one? Is it true? Is it some other string that means nothing to us? It just enforces that we are using a fixed name for the two states that we can have. We can be conscious or unconscious, and we can't call anything off this other than those two values. So we spoke about aggregate roots. This is one of those complicated concepts to explain, and it is easier to show than tell. In this instance, we have a private constructor. Why do we have a private constructor? Well, you can't create it through the factory. You've got to go through the factory class, which is, in this case, create as a static function. Now we're passing in hit points and armor class. But because we've created our value objects earlier, we are creating a class that is simple to understand, simple to read, and literally tells a story when we're looking at it. We generate a new character ID, and we're setting our initial status as conscious. We're not allowing those two to be changed because they are something that we don't want to change on this class at this time of construction. So our character will always start as conscious. It will always start with a new ID, but we will pass in hit points and armor class. So in the real world of D&D, you would create this on a massive sheet in advance with lots of random rolls to generate your class and your character's status. It does get confusing with some of the names because, yes, D&D uses the word class, but it's not the same concept as a PHP class. It's talking more about, are you a barbarian? Are you a wizard? Are you an elf? That kind of thing. So we could say that 0 HP is unconscious. And we could say character hit points is a new hit points of 0, and a character status is character status unconscious. We know that, but it bypasses the aggregate. So what records that event? What calculates that? So instead, we'll create a function called take damage. We pass in a damage, and it goes back to our hit points class and uses drop. Now, if you remember, drop will enforce that it will never drop below 0. We'll then say if the hit points at that point is 0, we'll set the status as character status unconscious, and we'll record a new event of character fainted with this ID. It's one method. It transitions the state and records the event, and it is always consistent. If you follow this method, you cannot deviate from the base rules. The attack method. The character decides if an attack lands. So you pass in the target character and an integer of role. Now, we could go to the extent of creating dice classes, but at that point it started getting really complex to show in simple code. But effectively, we could pass in a dice roll as a class of its own. So if the roll is greater than or equal to the armor class value, the target takes damage of 5. Now again, we could calculate that and we could implement further rules, but for the sake of simplicity, I oversimplified the rules here. Any purist D&D players would be screaming at this point. So roll versus armor class, it hits or misses, and the domain owns the combat rules. So we can't change the combat rules because we have our own attack class, our own attack function. So that gives you a brief introduction of the very basics of what it would look like to implement in pure code and what a domain would look like. But it gives us an opening to the bridge. This will introduce patterns that allows the domain to talk to the outside world, the ability to go and talk to things. So this is that character fainted event. We're passing in an interface of domain event. Now we could define ahead of time that certain rules have to be on each one. In this instance, we have a public constructor. So we're taking in that character ID value object, and we're taking in an immutable date time that is a new immutable date time by default. Theoretically, we can record events in the past and in the future by just creating a date time immutable and passing it in. We can get the character ID and we can get when it occurred. We can never change those after we have created this event. So how do we record and release events? Well, our character has a private array of events. It has the record that passes in the domain events and it puts it in the array. It's a really simple implementation of how to store events so that we could look back on the history and say what happened. But we can also release events, so we can get rid of events. So the events that we've got is the event from this class. We'll then set a new empty array and return what happened in the past. So that gives us the ability to keep hold of things that have happened in the past and clear this one. So we might choose to go and do something with those later, like store them in a database. So how would you use this? Well, your character takes damage of 20. Events is character release events. Because the damage has been done, our events, the character fainted. So we now have a copy of the events as a variable that tell us exactly what happened at any point in time. So the repository interface, this is where you have the tavern, the pub, whatever you want to call it. So why would you have a contract for this? Well, the domain defines a contract, but it never implements the contract for the outside world. So the interface for a character repository, it must have a find and it must have a save. That's all we care about at this simple point. And it allows us to define what we want to have on a repository, but we don't actually define the actions of that on there. The domain simply pretends that all characters are in a simple collection. It might be an array, it might be something really simple. So what would the first implementation look like? Well, we don't need a database. We'll have an in-memory character repository. We'll have a private array of characters. We'll have find implemented to find from that array by the ID to string or null. And we'll have the save where we'll set the ID to string as character. So that's the simplest implementation on top of our simple interface there. So we could swap this for eloquent or doctrine later. The domain never knows, and quite honestly, it never cares. So the command object, it's a simple DTO, but it carries an intent. So at this point, we would be looking at an attack command, an attack process. We'll have a character ID for the attacker, a character ID for the target, and then again, we could go to the extent of implementing dice, but I kept it simple by using an integer. The string attacker ID, string target ID, and role is what comes in. We'll then get the character ID from the string for both of those, and we'll set the role. We'll then allow getter functions for those. The orchestrator never contains business logic. So in this case, the attack handler will take in an attack command. The attacker, it finds from our repository. The target, it finds from our repository. If the attacker is not the same person as the target, because it would be really, sorry, if we don't have the attacker or we don't have the target, we throw a runtime exception that a character was not found. We should never be in the position that this happens. It would also be intelligent to check at this point that the attacker and the target don't have the same value, because it would be really stupid to attack yourself. But it does happen, believe it or not, in D&D. Your attacker will attack the target with a get roll. So we'll save the attacker and we'll save the target. That doesn't know what happened. All it knows is that an attack took place and then it saves the characters. It doesn't contain business logic of how to do that. So let's have a look at some real code. So I use NeoVim for editing. First off, let's prove this works. I've got two more here running. We'll get to these in a minute, but yes, we've implemented this with Laravel and Symfony. So we can run our basic attack, run scenario, and we can see that it comes out. We can see that we start with the fighter HP of 20, the goblin HP of 7. We can see that the fighter rolls 15, the goblin has 2 hits left and he's still conscious. It rolls again, and the goblin's HP is 0. So it got 18, so it should take 5 off 2, but that doesn't work. The goblin status is now unconscious, and we know that the character ID of that has fainted. Now, we can run that over and over and see the same thing happen any number of times. And just to prove that that isn't just randomly echoing, this is the implementation for that command. It requires vendor autoload, and then it uses all of the domain to make this happen. We'll set up our in-memory repository, we'll set up our attack handler, and then we'll create our 2 characters, the fighter and the goblin. We'll create them and save them both. At this point, we'll then do, what's our initial state? We'll get it from the fighter and the goblin. We'll then echo a simple divider. We'll set a role. Now, this could be a random number, but we'll set a role specifically for this one. Fighter rolls that number against the Goblin's AC of, which it gets from the armor class. We'll then run the attack command. So we'll run the attack of fighter gets ID, Goblin get ID, and roll the hits. We'll handle that attack, and we need to update the Goblin. So the updated Goblin is the character repository find of Goblin ID. Now, we could just have used Goblin again and overwritten the same variable, but I chose to do updated so that we can see that we're actually getting a different value. If I echoed both of those out, we'd see that they are different values at this point. So we can roll again and say the Goblin HP is, after the hit, is whatever the value of points is. We can get the status and check whether it's conscious or unconscious. We know that it's unconscious. We could choose to check that. So we do the same thing again. And it's as simple as running through like that for using the instance that we have. And you'll see that the code that I've used here is exactly what was in the slides. So if we look at the attack command, we can see that this code is identical to what I had in those slides. So implementing this has given us the domain that we need to use Dungeons and Dragons in our PHP. And compose a JSON. What have we got? Well, we've got a require of PHP 8.1 because it'd be stupid to not require PHP, and we have Ramses UUID. So this is a implementation of Dungeons and Dragons in domain driven. So that all seems very simple to do. I mean, they're pretty simple. You have your damage class, you've got your character ID class, exactly as we've done it. Now, why would you choose to implement everything in pure PHP? Well, that is where we proceed forward. So we've just seen that we have the value objects, the aggregates, the enums, we've got the events, we have the application. All of that is isolated in raw PHP, and we can run it. So what are we watching for? Character create forces the valid initial state. Attack and take damage. It's domain logic, not handler logic, so it does not care in the handler how we implement it. The character fainted event recorded when HP hits 0. And the in-memory character repository fulfills the interface with an array. There's no framework, no database, just pure domain logic. And just to show that, there's the in-memory. Simple array with find, save, and clear. We added clear on this. We could add that to our character repository over here if we wanted to. But in this case, we're saying that we want to clear to reset our specific implementation here. So what happens if we plug this into the real world? We as developers very often work in some sort of framework. I mean, off the top of my head, I can think of 10 different PHP frameworks that people work in all the time. But the bare implementations are almost always pure PHP. And if we build our PHP in a way that we can understand and see what is happening in code, well, then we can just plug it in. So the framework is the most outer shell. The domain that we have, it's the inner core. Effectively, it's an implementation of hexagonal architecture. So our framework worries about databases, caches, external APIs. The pure domain logic lies at the center of that and keeps it isolated. So we've probably heard the phrase, you could rewrite this in a different framework and throw everything away from the first framework you had. Domain driven, done the right way, you can do exactly that. So what about an eloquent repository? It's the same interface, but a different implementation. So in this case, we implement our character repository with find and save. We'll go and find our character model from the database using Eloquent, and we'll return the model. We'll return, if the model exists, a character mapper to the domain or null. And we'll save by character mapper to persistence save. So that gives us a very simple implementation of the Eloquent character repository for Laravel. And then the framework controller becomes trivial. It takes in an attack request, it takes in an attack handler, handle the new attack command with the request, and return your response of attack landed. If the framework changes, the game stays the same. We don't change how the game works. We don't change the logic of the application we build. So the same domain package in two different frameworks, Laravel and Symfony. Both Laravel and Symfony pull in the domain as a composer path dependency. So in this case, I'm literally pulling it in from raw PHP. You could have this as a full composer package and you wouldn't need to do the repository setup. You just require your D&D and code as a package. It's a standalone package and the framework is just a consumer of what you've written. So let's take a look at Laravel. What are we looking for? Well, we can see the DDD service provider. We can see the Eloquent character repository, the mappers, and the attack controller, and the migration. So first off, let's go back over here and we'll go to run services. If I clear this and go down directory, and I've forgotten my own command name, we'll do PHP artisan run command. So here you can see that we got a 12 and an 18. So we set them up, we run our attack, but with this one, I did do random. And it will just run through, each time being a different attack process just by randomizing. So what does that look like? Let's look at the service provider. There's the DDD service provider. We're simply binding the character repository and the Eloquent character repository to the class. That's it. That's all we need to do. Set up a basic bind in Laravel, and now it understands what to do. So that seems simple, maybe even too simple. Over in infrastructure, we can see what the Eloquent character repository looks like. We find it, and we save it. That's it. It really is that simple to re-implement this in Laravel. And if we look at our models, well, we have a user that Laravel chucks out that we don't actually need. I could have deleted that. We have our character. I mean, that's complicated, right? Four basic parameters on that model. Seems pretty simple to use to me. Mappers is where it gets interesting. So how do we map to domain? Domain character reconstitute. Character ID from string, new hit points, new armor class, and character status. To persistence, we'll do it in reverse. It will save back to Eloquent as the domain has had the values set up. Pretty simple to follow through with that. And if we look at the reconstitute, what's over here in the character? Pretty simple. Takes in a character ID, the hit points, the armor class, and the status, rehydrates, saves it. That allows us to do everything that we need to for the character in one simple model. And then to persistence, I forgot to implement find or new. So find or new would find from the database the character that we want or create a new one. Oh, actually, of course, that's one of Eloquent's own values. Implementing this in Laravel became a walk in the park with the controller. It constructs with the handler and the repository. It does the setup, and then we have an invocable call here. And all that does, in a real D&D game, the roll would be random. As I said, so we're doing a random int. We could use lottery, we could use anything that generates this number. And again, we could have all of this built into a dice class. So we could have a D20, a D6, a D4. There are multiple different dice that we can use. And our command that we saw running does have all of this happening through the domain. Now, you could see here that we have the Laravel server running. And here's the Laravel setup. Let's set up some characters, which calls through to the database, through to the domain, creates our characters, and we know that the goblin is currently conscious. Let's attack it. Well, we finished with a roll at 12, and it updated our HP. Let's attack again. Oh, he's unconscious. Let's reset. Set up the characters. We can see that he becomes unconscious again. We can reset. And it will constantly follow through. And in this occasion, it took 3 or 4 hits before we got him in the end. That is exactly the same thing implemented just by API calls back to the backend. So if we go back to Laravel and we look at this, we can see that we just call over and over that process in an API. And if we look over at the resources, views, and D&D, which is where this is, we set up some styling, and here's the script. So we get some document elements to set everything up, and down here a bit further, there will be an API call. There you go. Await fetch API setup. Attack goblin. It'll tell you that you can't do that without setting up your characters first. And it will do further API calls back to the system to make that work. It's literally using the domain to do the job for us. So that's implemented in Laravel. The key files, well, they're the roots API, as I've shown you. And the Eloquent implementation is bound by character repository and Eloquent character repository. So by binding those two in the way that we have, when we call for character repository, we get the Eloquent character repository. The framework just wires and roots. It doesn't actually do anything with the domain. It just remains untouched and pure code. But we could do the same thing in Symfony. So you could see that we can run app create schema. So let's grab that command. And we'll go to our run services. If I clear here, there you go, database schema created. And then we'll run our scenario. So we can grab that command. And we can see that in Symfony, the same thing happens. It will go through, it will randomly roll until the goblin faints. That time it took 2, 4, 2, 7. It's a completely random system. Again, it's using the domain. So how does Symfony do this slightly differently? Well, let's go and take a look. So in Symfony, again, our composer JSON, it requires a few things more, but you can see here that we're using our raw PHP, which is set up further down, somewhere around here, but it's set up to load from our path there. So that pulls in from our path the raw domain. We can see if we go to config services, that's where it maps everything. So we're auto wiring and we're auto configuring. And then we're saying that character repository is an alias for doctrine character repository. So what's the difference? Let's go and take a look. So we're in source and infrastructure, repositories, doctrine, character. Same base. But this time, we're using doctrines language to implement what we need from the repository. That is literally the only difference. We implement the doctrine model rather than the eloquent model, and we have exactly the same principle. We can fetch and store to our database. So the character mapper is very similar, except in this case, domain character reconstitute. It's over here. Again, it does it doctrine's way, not Laravel's way. And we have exactly the same principle. But again, we had Symfony running, and we can go over here where it's Symfony. Port 8001 is Symfony. We could do exactly the same thing again, just by implementing the same domain in multiple different ways. And I could have implemented this with Cake PHP. I could have implemented it with Slim PHP. I could have continued and done my own framework around the same domain. So what it gives us is a very simple little way of implementing code that we can literally throw the framework away and reuse it. But that isn't the only thing that it gives us. It gives us multiple ways to implement the same logic. It gives us multiple ways to refer back to the logic. What if you had 10 different systems? Let's say that you are a mobile developer and you're developing for Android, and you're developing for iOS, and you're developing for BlackBerry, if that even is still a thing. You could be going over and over and over and re-implementing the same thing in 20 different ways. Separate your logic out, create it in the domain-driven way, in pure PHP, pull it into your application, and you can use it however you want. You can use it in such a way that that code becomes the source of truth of how to use this logic. So where would we go next? We could wire character fainted to notifications, logs, UI updates, text messages, emails. We could do anything with those events. Well, we swapped in memory for a real database with Doctrine and Eloquent. We could continue to do that with other systems. We could implement further services. We could implement critical hits, initiative, spell resolution. By isolating the logic into domains, we can grow the logic before the implementation. Now, yes, you could do that inside a framework, but what you can do by isolating it is build it over and over and over in multiple different ways, just by implementing the base logic and then using it in the framework. Testing. Well, we can have 100% domain coverage with no database needed just by calling the domain. We could have that in the domain tests itself. Then it's just simple UI checks, simple API checks. We can read models. We could do projections for leaderboards. We could do combat logs. We could implement things like a multiplayer system that would allow us to do a 10-player Dungeons and Dragons campaign over 30 days. We could do anything with the domain because the principles exist. So normally this would be a lot longer talk than I've done, but I want to leave enough time for people to ask questions at the end. So why would we bother with it? What's the return of investment on going the domain-driven base? We can guarantee 100% coverage of the rules without a database. We could make sure that our coverage of the entire logic of the app can run without ever touching a database. Your code survives framework migration, so it doesn't matter whether you're using the latest shiny framework or whether you're using the framework that was invented 30 years ago that's still running perfectly. it doesn't matter because the code is simple logic. And it gives you clarity. It reads like the player's handbook. It gives you, it's not a manual for Eloquent, Doctrine, Laravel. It's a manual for how to play the game, how to do the logic of your app. So there's a couple of resources. Vaughan Vernon has a great set of examples. Ramsey, unsurprisingly, has the best UUID package on the internet, and we have Assert, which gives us assertion levels within code, very similar to PHP assertions. So I guess the question would be, how would you choose to handle critical hits? So critical hits are the ability to double the damage in D&D in particular circumstances. So it gives you something to think about. Now, I have pushed this code directly up to my GitHub, and I'll make sure the link gets sent out shortly, but it'll be Miller PHP. And if I remember correctly, it's /DDD-merge-PHP. So at that point, I'm going to open it up for questions. I can already see it. Omar wanted a Stranger Things reference, so I think I got that in straight at the start.
Yep. So I've checked with the folks on YouTube to see if they have any questions, waiting for that to filter in now. For the folks here in Austin, any questions for Chris?
Yes. Can you hear me?
I'll repeat it for the stream anyway.
How do you decide when to start this way versus decide that you should have started this way and can work to it?
So for the stream, that the question is, when are cases when you just decide to start with this way versus when you get partway through and realize that you should have started this way?
Usually, the point I find out is when I need to build something again. But quite honestly, it's my default these days to go to domain-driven first, event-driven second, and simply because it just makes code so much easier to understand. I mean, I've dealt with spaghetti code that is horrendous, and I've dealt with domain-driven that's so abstracted it's also horrendous. But a lot of it is, honestly, firstly, talk to the people you work with, talk to the people that are developers at your customer. However you're looking at the code, talk to the people around you. If you're the person making the decision, well, you can choose for yourself whether you want to go straight into that. If it's something that's new to the team, you're going to need buy-in from the team. So if I went off and started with creating full domain-driven implementation in an application that's never seen it, people are going to be confused by that standard and that way of developing. And anybody that's seen any of my codes, any of my previous talks, you'll hear me say it over and over. Talk to people, decide what you want to do, and work from there.
Thanks. Checking the chat, making sure that I haven't overlooked questions there. Anybody else here locally, or I think Alina has got a group in person there. So if you want to relay questions on, I'll give it another 30 seconds or so.
I like the fact that one of my colleagues is loving the D&D references. I've now discovered that I have a colleague that plays D&D.
Cool. Well, seeing, yeah, okay. Thanks so much, Chris, for presenting this evening, or in your case, very early morning for Merge PHP, and the various user groups tuning in person to kind of bring US-based PHP meetups back. Again, thanks so much for reprising this talk that I actually saw back at Tech last year, and like, this is amazing. I want more people to see this. It's been a privilege to sit in attendance of it for a second time, and thanks so much for presenting.
Ian, we've had one more question from Derek Caswell. He says, if you have a very mature large system, how would you move to this? So the first step is little by little. You don't have to implement the whole thing domain driven from day one. You could choose to use the new the broken window idea. You could choose to go and implement something new in domain driven state, and then the next time you touch another feature, go and modify that, and then the next time you touch another one, modify that. Over time, the entire code base would become domain driven. But one of the things about domain driven is it doesn't force you to do that for every aspect of the code. So I've actually started implementing today at work a new strategy pattern for exports, and there's about 10 different ways of communicating with the third parties. And one of the things I wanted to do was ensure that it was built domain driven so that everything was isolated to one place. The rest of the code base I'm working on isn't domain driven, but this section will be. And maybe the next feature I do will be. But you can build it little by little and move parts out as it makes sense. So all domain driven is a refactoring of the same logic as you've got now into isolated components. And for me, I would do that anyway as I'm looking at new sections. We've also had another question from Labib Bull. Says, has anyone used Valena? I have heard about it, but haven't used it yet. It does look interesting.
Cool. Thanks so much for catching those questions on the chat as I was doing closing there. Again, appreciate you presenting, and hope to see you either in attendance on one of these or potentially at a future meetup or conference.
Well, I should be at Tech this year. I'll be at PHP UK later on next week. And there's a possibility that I'll end up speaking at Laravel London soon as well.
Awesome. Well, thanks, and have a good rest of your evening.
And you, thank you.
And with that, thanks to everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you here next month.